When Mark stepped into our dining room on January 25th, he stopped so suddenly that his keys slipped from his hand. His ex-wife was sitting beside me. Between us lay a silver Christmas bell, engraved with the words, Hannah, Christmas 2012, 2 phones, and a stamped envelope from my attorney. "Why is she here?" he asked. Claire turned her screen toward him. "You told me Rachel asked Sophie to call me Mom." I placed my phone beside hers. "And you told me Claire was selling the house and leaving after Christmas?" Mark looked from one message to the other. For the first time in 8 years, he had no version of the truth left to hide behind. A month earlier, he had told me how happy he was to finally have a good relationship with Claire. Then he announced that our 7-year-old daughter would spend Christmas in her house and call her mom for the day. I asked him, "Do you really want to do that?" He smirked. "If you don't like it, divorce me." Now Claire pressed play on a video I had never seen. Sophie appeared on the screen in a red velvet dress, standing beneath 3 stockings. One said Mark. One said Claire. The third carried a name that was not mine and was not my daughter's. Sophie looked toward someone behind the camera and whispered, "When can I be Sophie again?" Mark lunged for the phone. I covered it with my hand. "No," I said. "This time, you listen." His face went white. Before the worst part of the video had even begun. "Before I tell you how we reached that table, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me until the end. And please subscribe to the channel if you believe every child deserves to feel safe inside her own family." The first sign that Christmas was going wrong was a crooked paper star. Sophie and I were sitting at the kitchen table 6 days before Christmas, surrounded by yellow paper, glitter, and strips of tape that kept sticking to our sleeves. She had written Sophie across the middle of her star in letters so large that the final E bent down one side. "It won't fit," she said. "It fits because it's yours," I told her. "Your name can take up as much room as it needs." She smiled and pressed the star flat with both palms. At 7, Sophie still believed most broken things could be fixed with tape and patience. For a long time, I believed the same thing about marriage. Mark's phone rang while he stood at the counter. He glanced at the screen and walked toward the living room before answering. "Claire," he said, and something in his voice softened. I kept helping Sophie, but I heard pieces of the conversation. Boxes, the upstairs closet, Hannah's room. Mark said he remembered where the ornaments were stored and promised he would come by before the sale. I knew about Hannah. She had been Mark and Claire's only child, and she had died at 7, the same age Sophie had turned in November. Mark said grief had hollowed out his first marriage, until there was nothing left to save. Whenever I asked what happened between them, he said some memories belonged to the people who survived them. I accepted that because I did not want to be the second wife who competed with a dead child or resented a grieving mother. When Mark returned to the kitchen, his eyes were red around the edges. "Claire is finally selling the house," he said. "Closing should be at the end of January." I thought that was what she wanted. It is. She just wants one last Christmas dinner there before everything is packed away. I pictured the 4 of us sitting through an awkward meal. "All right, we can bring dessert." Mark's expression tightened. "You're not coming." The tape stopped moving through my fingers. A piece folded against my thumb and stuck there. "What do you mean?" "This is about Hannah. Claire can't do it with you in the room." I looked at Sophie, who was cutting another strip of paper. "Then why would Sophie be there?" "Because she makes Claire happy." The answer landed wrong, but I still gave him room to explain. "Claire kept a red Christmas dress," he said. "She thought Sophie could wear it for dinner." I peeled the tape from my skin. "Why does Claire have a dress in Sophie's size?" "She kept things." The refrigerator hummed in the silence. Then he said, "Claire would also like Sophie to call her mom that day." My hand went still. "Not Claire. Not Miss Claire. Mom." The kitchen seemed to shrink around me. Sophie's scissors scraped the paper, and the sound felt too sharp. Why would a memorial dinner require our daughter to call your ex-wife Mom? It's one word, Rachel. It's my name to her. No, it's a role. Claire had that role before she lost Hannah. And that means she gets to borrow it from Sophie? His jaw tightened. You're making something kind ugly. I'm asking what this is. It's one day. Claire is packing up the last place where she was Hannah's mother. Sophie can give her a few hours of comfort. I stared at him. Do you really want to do that? I was giving him one last chance to hear himself, before he crossed a line he could not pretend not to see. Mark leaned back and gave me a thin smile. If you don't like it, divorce me. He knew that word frightened me. My parents had used separation as a weapon throughout my childhood. Mark knew I had spent 8 years trying to make our home feel more permanent than the one I grew up in. He expected me to retreat. Before I could answer, Sophie looked up. Who's getting divorced? Mark's face changed at once. His voice became warm. Nobody, sweetheart. Your mom and I are talking about a Christmas game. Cold settled beneath my ribs. He crouched beside her chair. Claire is going to be sad because it's her last Christmas in the old house. You could wear a pretty red dress and call her Mom for the game. It would make her feel special. Sophie looked at me before she looked at him. Do I have to? Mark smiled. Only if you want to be kind. It was not a command, but it did not sound like a choice. I wanted to take Sophie upstairs and end the discussion. Instead, I remembered every school pickup Mark had made, every fever he had sat through, every night he had carried Sophie from the couch to bed. Until then, I had trusted him as her father, even when I was angry with him as my husband. It is only dinner? I asked. A few hours. She comes home by 7. Your phone stays on. She can call me whenever she wants. Nobody pressures her to call Claire anything. Mark stood. You have made your position painfully clear. I picked up my phone and wrote it down, because his tone made me realize spoken words could be reshaped later. I do not consent to Sophie being pressured to call anyone else Mom. She comes home by 7, and I need to be able to reach her. His reply appeared while he was still across from me. You are turning an act of kindness into something ugly. I saved the message. For the next several days, Mark acted as if the matter were settled. He wrapped gifts, played Christmas music, and told Sophie how happy Claire would be to see her. Each time he called it a game, Sophie watched my face for instructions I did not know how to give. On Christmas morning, I woke before dawn and found Mark carrying a garment bag toward the garage. The zipper was partly open. A strip of dark red velvet showed through. Sophie came down in her winter coat, clutching the crooked paper star. I tucked it into the front pocket of her backpack. So you have something that belongs to you, I said. She hugged me tightly. Mark opened the passenger door and said they were already late. I followed them onto the driveway. As he started the engine, Sophie lowered her window before the car moved. Mom, she called, her voice small. If I call her Mom for the game, are you still my mom when I come home? I stepped toward the car, but Mark pulled away before I could finish answering. The car disappeared at the end of our street before I could answer Sophie's question. I stood in the driveway, with my slippers soaking through, staring at the empty road as though Mark might realize what he had done and turn around. He did not. By the time I went back inside, the house already felt different, not peaceful or quiet, but abandoned in a way that made every familiar room seem staged. I kept telling myself Sophie would be home by 7. Mark had promised a few hours, and I had his promise in writing. Instead of reassuring me, the silence made me hear Sophie's question again. Would I still be her mother when she came home? I tried to make the morning look normal for her return. I put a small ham in the oven, peeled potatoes, and set aside the cinnamon rolls she liked. The crooked paper star from her backpack should have gone with her, but I found it beneath the kitchen chair. I carried it to the living room and hung it near the front of the tree, with her oversized name facing the room. At 11:20, Mark sent the first photograph. Sophie stood beside a tall Christmas tree, in the red velvet dress I had seen through the garment bag. Her hair had been curled and pinned back with a white ribbon. The dress fit her shoulders, waist, and arms so precisely that I stopped believing Claire had pulled it from a random box that morning. Someone had known it would fit. I enlarged the image. Behind Sophie, Claire's living room looked less like a house being packed and more like a room sealed against time. 3 stockings hung beneath the mantel, each stitched with a name too small for me to read. Sophie was smiling, but I knew that smile. Her mouth curved while the rest of her face stayed still. It was the expression she wore when an adult held a camera too long and told her not to move yet. I called Mark. He declined the call and sent a message saying they were eating, and I needed to stop interrupting Claire's closure. I wrote back that I wanted to speak to Sophie, not Claire. He did not answer, and my second call went to voicemail. For several minutes, I stood in the kitchen holding my phone while the oven timer beeped behind me. I wanted to drive straight to Claire's house. I knew the address, and it was less than 40 minutes away. But I also knew how Mark would frame it. He would say I had arrived shouting at a grieving mother on the last Christmas in her home. He would use my anger to make his demand look harmless. At 12:46, he sent another photograph instead of calling. Mark and Claire sat on either side of Sophie, on a cream-colored couch. Claire's hand rested across Sophie's shoulders, while Mark leaned close enough that his arm touched Claire's. All 3 wore shades of red. The image looked like a family Christmas card, except Sophie's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. My first thought was that Mark and Claire were trying to become a family again. The thought was so sharp that I had to put the phone down. I reminded myself that jealousy was not evidence. Then, I looked again at Sophie's eyes. They were fixed somewhere beyond the camera, as if she were waiting for instructions. I sent Mark another message. I told him I needed to speak to Sophie immediately and reminded him that she was to be home by 7. 10 minutes later, he replied that she was fine and that I needed to stop turning Claire's closure into a custody fight. I had never used the word custody. Seeing it on his screen made my stomach tighten. I saved the exchange and placed my phone beside Sophie's plate at the kitchen table. The afternoon moved slowly. I reheated the ham, then finally turned the oven off. Every time headlights crossed the front windows, I stood up. At 7, the chair across from me was still empty. I called Mark and got voicemail. At 7:10, I texted that I expected them home immediately. At 7:20, I put on my coat, took my keys from the hook, and walked to the garage. I was opening the car door when Mark finally called. "We're leaving soon," he said. "You were supposed to be here 20 minutes ago. We're finishing the pictures." "You told me dinner. You didn't tell me you were staging a photo session." His voice hardened. "Sophie is safe. That is all you need to know." "No, I need a time." After a long sigh, he said, 7:45. I told him I wanted her home by then, not leaving then. He hung up, so I sent the same sentence by text. I needed a record, because I no longer trusted him to remember a promise once it became inconvenient. The garage door finally opened at 8:19. Mark came in first, carrying 2 gift bags and talking before I asked a question. He said Claire had made Hannah's favorite stuffing. He said they had found old ornaments and laughed over the names Hannah had given them. Sophie followed several steps behind him. Her winter coat was buttoned to her chin, but the red velvet skirt showed beneath it. She did not look toward the kitchen or the tree. She walked straight to me and pressed her face against my side. "Did you eat?" I asked. She nodded without lifting her head. Mark set a small silver bell on the kitchen table. He said Claire wanted Sophie to have it because she had brought life back into the house. I reached for it, but Mark placed a gift bag in front of me and began pulling out containers of leftovers. By the time I moved the food aside, Sophie was tugging at my hand. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" Mark laughed softly and said she was exhausted from too much excitement. Sophie did not smile. When he bent to kiss her head, She stepped behind me. I took her upstairs without asking Mark to explain. If something had frightened her, I would not force her to perform it again in front of the person she was avoiding. In her bedroom, I unbuttoned her coat. She grabbed the red skirt with both hands and said she did not want it in her room. I helped her change into blue pajamas and laid the dress over my arm. The velvet felt old but carefully preserved, and the inside tag had been cut away. Sophie watched until I carried it into the hallway and placed it over the banister. When I returned, she had pulled the blanket to her chin. I lay beside her and left the lamp on. I did not ask whether she had called Claire Mom. I did not ask why Mark kept her late or what happened during the photographs. I only told her she was home and that she did not have to talk until she wanted to. Mark appeared in the doorway and told me not to encourage her because she had enjoyed the day. I looked at him over Sophie's head and said he had ignored every boundary we agreed on. He accused me of planting drama in her mind because I was jealous of Claire. Sophie's body tightened beside me, so I told him we would speak later and closed the door. For a long time, Sophie said nothing. The house settled around us, and a Christmas movie played faintly downstairs. I thought she had fallen asleep until her hand found mine beneath the blanket. "Daddy said I had to be Hannah until the pictures were done," she whispered. I kept my breathing even. "What do you think that meant?" "I don't know." Her fingers closed around mine. "I just wanted to be Sophie again." I stayed beside her until her breathing deepened. Only then did I go downstairs. Mark had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still playing. The silver bell remained on the kitchen table. I picked it up by the white ribbon. It was heavier than it looked, cold against my palm, with tiny scratches around the rim. I turned it over. Engraved across the bottom were the words Hannah, Christmas 2012. Love, Mom. I stood at the kitchen table with the silver bell resting in my palm, reading the engraving again as if the words might change. Hannah, Christmas 2012. Love, Mom. Mark was asleep in the living room, one arm hanging from the couch, while an old Christmas movie flickered across his face. Upstairs, Sophie was curled beneath my blanket after asking when she could stop being someone else. I slipped the bell into a padded envelope, sealed it, and wrote the date across the front. I did not know what I would do with it, but I knew I could not leave it where Sophie might see it in the morning. Throwing it away felt wrong. It had belonged to Hannah, and whatever Mark had done, Hannah had not done anything to us. The next morning, Sophie came downstairs wearing blue leggings and one of my gray sweatshirts. When I offered her the red plaid pajamas her grandmother had mailed, she stepped back so quickly that her shoulders struck the refrigerator. "Not red," she said, then immediately lowered her eyes. "Sorry. I'm sorry, Mom. You do not have to apologize for choosing pajamas." She watched my face as if waiting to see whether I meant it. Then she glanced toward the living room where Mark was pouring coffee and corrected herself. "Can I call you Rachel today?" The question hurt more than I expected, but I kept my voice steady. "You can call me Mom whenever you want. Nobody can make that word stop belonging to us." Mark set his mug down harder than necessary. "You are feeding this." Sophie flinched before he had even raised his voice. She whispered another apology and hurried upstairs. I waited until her door closed before turning to him. "What happened in that house?" "A Christmas dinner happened." Claire smiled for the first time in years, and Sophie helped give her that. "You should be proud of your daughter instead of teaching her to feel guilty." I took the sealed envelope from the counter and placed it between us. Why was Hannah's bell around Sophie's neck? His eyes dropped to the date I had written. Claire wanted it to be loved instead of buried in a box. "And the dress?" He opened a cabinet, even though there was nothing inside he needed. "What about it?" "Busted Hannah's." Mark kept his back to me. "Clothes do not belong to dead people forever." The cruelty of the sentence was not in the volume. He said it calmly, as though he were explaining a household rule I had failed to understand. "They do not automatically belong to Sophie either. Rachel, it was fabric and a bell. Claire lost a child. Sophie gave those things a little life again. She is not a place to store somebody else's memories. He turned then, his expression tightening. You keep reducing this to ownership. Mom is a role. The dress is a dress. The bell is an object. If using them helped Claire, what exactly was harmed? Sophie. He looked almost offended by the answer. She had dinner, opened presents, and took pictures. You are the one making her think something terrible happened. I thought of Sophie gripping my hand beneath the blanket and saying she had to be Hannah until the pictures were done. Mark's world suddenly looked frighteningly simple. Names, roles, clothes, even a child's place inside a family could be transferred if he believed the purpose was kind enough. She will not see Claire again until the adults explain exactly what happened and Sophie feels safe. You do not get to punish Claire because you are jealous. This is not about Claire's feelings. You are interfering with my relationship with my daughter. No, I am putting a boundary around our daughter because you ignored every boundary I gave you. Mark stared at me as if he expected the old Rachel to return, the one who would soften her words until he could agree with them. When I did not, he picked up his keys and left without finishing his coffee. For the next 2 days, Sophie moved through the house, as if every room contained a test. She apologized when she spilled water, when she changed the television channel, and when she asked for the hall light to remain on at night. Each time Mark entered, her eyes went to my face before she spoke. She stopped calling for me from another room. Instead, she came close, touched my sleeve, and waited. I called a child therapist from the referral list provided by the rehabilitation center where I worked. Dr. Priya Shah had an opening on December 30th. When she asked what I wanted from the appointment, I told her the truth. I do not need you to prove my husband is a bad person. I need to know how to help my daughter without putting words in her mouth. Dr. Shah told me not to question Sophie, as if I were assembling a case. I was to use open prompts, keep routines predictable, write down only the words Sophie offered on her own, and avoid discussing adult motives where she could hear. She said a frightened child often tries to give the answer that seems safest, especially when she believes the adult's relationship depends on it. Let her know she does not have to protect anyone from her feelings, Dr. Shah said. Not you, not her father, and not Claire. During the appointment, Sophie chose colored pencils from a wooden box and drew a square house with smoke curling from the chimney. She placed Mark and Claire behind 2 windows. Then she drew me outside beside a tree, my arms hanging straight at my sides. Dr. Shah did not ask why I was outside. She simply said, "Tell me about your picture." Sophie shaded the roof blue. "That is the Christmas house. And who lives there?" "Nobody now. Claire is selling it." She pressed harder on the blue pencil. "Daddy said after New Year families might be different." My chest tightened, but I kept my hands folded. Dr. Shah asked, "What did different mean to you?" Sophie looked at me. "Maybe Mom would live somewhere else." I waited until she looked back at the paper. "Did Dad tell you I would not be your mother anymore?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. He said Claire needed a turn." The room seemed to tilt. Mark had taken the threat he used against me and translated it into words a 7-year-old could fear. He had not told Sophie I would disappear. He had given her something worse. The idea that motherhood was a position adults could pass around when another woman needed it more. Dr. Shah shifted the paper so Sophie could reach the green pencil. "Do you think being kind means giving someone your mother?" Sophie's lip trembled. I did not want Claire to cry. "You are not responsible for stopping grown-ups from crying," I said. "You are allowed to be Sophie, even when somebody is sad." She leaned against my arm, and for the first time since Christmas, her shoulders loosened. That evening, I opened a notebook and wrote December 25th at the top of the first page. I recorded the time Mark left, the calls he ignored, the time he returned, Sophie's words about being Hannah, and the engraving on the bell. I did not write what I believed Mark intended. I wrote only what happened and what was said. Mark saw the appointment notification on our shared calendar, before I could remove it. He came into the bedroom holding his phone. "You took her to a therapist without discussing it with me?" "I took her to someone who could help her feel safe." "You are creating a record against me." "I am helping Sophie." "You want a professional to repeat your version." I closed the notebook. Dr. Shah told me not to give Sophie a version. Mark waited for me to defend myself further, but I did not. I did not explain that I had chosen someone neutral, or promise that I was not trying to ruin him. For once, being understood by Mark mattered less than being clear. After he left the room, I opened the photographs he had sent on Christmas. I enlarged the first picture until the image blurred, then moved across the mantel behind Sophie. 3 stockings hung there. Mark, Claire. The third name had been hidden by Sophie's shoulder, in the smaller image. I spread 2 fingers across the screen and brought the stitching into focus. The stocking did not say Sophie. It said Hannah. The name on the stocking changed the photograph from something uncomfortable into something deliberate. Claire had not simply placed Sophie near an old Christmas tree. Someone had hung Hannah's stocking behind her, dressed her in Hannah's clothes, and positioned her where Hannah was supposed to be. I needed to know whether the rest of the room had been arranged with the same purpose. I did not touch Mark's phone or try to enter Claire's private accounts. After Sophie went to bed on New Year's Eve, I searched only what had already been made public. Mark's sister, Diane, had once shared yearly memorial posts for Hannah, and her profile was still visible to family friends. I scrolled through birthday messages and charity fundraisers until I found a post dated 13 years earlier. The caption read, "Our last Christmas with sweet Hannah. We did not know how precious an ordinary morning could be." The picture beneath it made my hands turn cold. Mark sat on the left side of a cream-colored couch. Claire sat on the right, with 7-year-old Hannah between them in a dark red velvet dress. A tall tree stood behind Mark's shoulder. 3 stockings hung from the mantel in exactly the same order as the photograph Mark had sent me. Mark, Claire, Hannah. Hannah wore the silver bell around her neck. I placed my phone beside Mark's Christmas photograph and moved between the 2 images. The angle of the tree was identical. The chairs had been shifted to the same positions. Even the wrapped boxes near the fireplace had been stacked to imitate the old arrangement. Sophie had not merely attended a memorial dinner. She had been placed inside a photograph that already existed. There was one difference I could not stop looking at. In the original picture, Hannah had turned her face toward Claire. She looked relaxed, caught in the middle of a real smile. In the new photograph, Sophie looked past the camera. Her body faced forward, but her eyes were fixed on someone standing behind it, waiting for permission to move. My first conclusion was the most obvious one. Mark and Claire were trying to become a family again. The dress, the stockings, and the matching photograph looked like proof that they had already begun erasing me. I sat at the dining table until after midnight, studying their faces and wondering how long Mark had been imagining a life in which I was no longer present. The next morning, I took an old family album from the cabinet beneath the stairs. Mark had brought it into our marriage, but rarely opened it. Most of the photographs showed birthdays, vacations, and ordinary afternoons before Hannah became sick. Near the back, I found another copy of the same Christmas photograph. A date had been written beneath it in Claire's handwriting. The 25th of December, 2012. One perfect morning. Mark came into the dining room while both photographs were lying in front of me. He stopped, but he did not look surprised for long. "You recreated it," I said. He set his coffee on the table. Claire's therapist once told her that revisiting a painful memory in a safe way could help change how it felt. Was her therapist there? No. Did this therapist tell her to replace Hannah with Sophie? His mouth tightened. Nobody replaced anyone. It was a therapeutic exercise. I turned the new photograph toward him. Sophie said she had to be Hannah until the pictures were finished. She was playing pretend. Children do that every day. She did not choose the game. She agreed to wear the dress. I opened the message I had sent before Christmas, and placed my phone beside the photographs. I told you she was not to be pressured into calling Claire mom. And she was not pressured. You told her refusing would make a grieving woman sad. That is your interpretation. It is what she understood. Mark sat across from me with the same calm expression he used during disagreements at work. Rachel, you are collecting harmless details and arranging them into the ugliest possible story. Sophie had a good meal, received gifts, and helped Claire close an impossible chapter of her life. I pointed to the stockings. Why was Hannah's name behind my daughter? Because it was Hannah's stocking. Then why was Sophie standing beneath it? Because that was where the light was best. I almost laughed, but nothing about his answer was funny. Why was there no sign that Sophie had a mother? No stocking, no photograph, not even the star she made. You were not part of that memory. I am part of Sophie. Your presence would have changed the feeling Claire needed. There it was. Not an accident or an oversight. I had been removed because the scene worked better without me. I asked what he had meant when he told Sophie that families might be different after New Year's. Mark looked toward the staircase before answering. She misunderstood an adult conversation about the house. She thinks I may live somewhere else. Because you keep talking about divorce. You introduced that word. You asked whether I wanted to go through with Christmas. I answered honestly. If you cannot tolerate one difficult day connected to my dead daughter, perhaps you should consider whether this marriage works for you. He had found a way to turn his threat into evidence of my intolerance. I stared at him and understood why arguments with Mark always left me defending my character instead of discussing his actions. What happens at the end of January? I asked. The house sale closes on the 25th. Claire is moving to a smaller place outside Harrisburg. The old house will be gone, the boxes will be packed, and this will be over. Completely over? Yes. He reached across the table, as if offering a reasonable compromise. Give me 1 month. Stop questioning Sophie. Stop taking her to appointments designed to make me look dangerous. Do not poison her against her father. By the end of January, Claire will be gone, and we can return to normal. The promise should have comforted me. Instead, I noticed how carefully he had described Claire leaving, while saying nothing about what he planned to do. For years, Mark had described the collapse of his first marriage as something Claire had caused by refusing to release the past. He said she had turned Hannah's room into a shrine, and made grief the only subject their marriage was allowed to contain. Looking at the 2 photographs, I began to wonder whether Claire had really trapped him in the past, or whether Mark had left out the part where he kept returning to it whenever the present disappointed him. Sophie came into the dining room, carrying her box of colored pencils. I reached to cover the photographs, but she had already seen them. Her eyes moved from Hannah's face to her own. That's the picture Dad said we had to fix, she said. I kept my voice quiet. What did he mean by fix? Sophie climbed into the chair beside me. He said the first one ended wrong. What was supposed to be different this time? She touched the edge of the new photograph. I had to look happy until Claire believed it. Mark appeared in the doorway before I could respond. What are you asking her now? I asked what she meant. You are interrogating a 7-year-old because you cannot stand that Claire had one peaceful day. Sophie pulled her hands into her sleeves. Mark continued talking, but I no longer needed him to explain what the photographs had already shown me. I gathered both pictures, took Sophie's pencils, and led her upstairs without arguing. In her room, we sat on the floor and finished coloring the crooked paper star. Sophie added green dots around her name and asked whether we could hang it back on the tree, even though Christmas was over. I told her we could leave it there, as long as she wanted. When I went downstairs, Mark was in the garage. His phone lay face up on the dining table, lighting briefly with an incoming message. I did not touch it or open the notification. I did not need to. The preview was long enough to read. Claire, have you told Rachel yet? You promised before the 25th. The message disappeared from Mark's screen before he returned from the garage, but I had already memorized every word. Claire had not asked whether the house sale was ready. She had asked whether Mark had told me something he had promised to reveal before January 25th. I waited until Sophie was upstairs before asking him. "What are you supposed to tell me before the 25th? Mark stopped beside the dining table. His eyes flicked toward his phone, and for half a second I saw calculation replace surprise. Then his face settled into the calm expression he used whenever he wanted my fear to look unreasonable. "Claire wants to make sure you understand that the house will be sold," he said. "She thinks you still believe she intends to stay involved after closing." That is not what her message said. It is exactly what she meant. She asked whether you had told me yet. "What are you supposed to tell me?" Mark picked up his phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Rachel, not every sentence is evidence of a conspiracy." I held his gaze. "Are you planning to leave this marriage?" His eyebrows lifted as though I had accused him without warning. "You are the one who keeps bringing up divorce. You told me to divorce you. During an argument you started because you could not tolerate one Christmas connected to Hannah." I felt the familiar pull to defend myself, to explain every step until he admitted my reaction made sense. This time, I noticed what he was doing before I followed him there. He had not answered my question. He had turned my question into proof that I was the problem. "I asked whether you intend to leave," I said. "You have taken Sophie to a therapist, started keeping notes, searched for old photographs, and questioned every detail of a memorial dinner. If anyone is preparing to end this marriage, it appears to be you. I started keeping notes because you deny things after they happen." His voice remained level. "Listen to yourself. You are documenting your own family like we are suspects." He did not raise his voice or insult me directly. He made concern sound like obsession and preparation sound like instability. By the time he walked away, I understood that he no longer needed to argue about the dress, the stocking, or Sophie being called Hannah. He only needed to convince me that asking about them made me unreliable. The next morning, I went to work because patients still needed appointments even while my marriage was coming apart. At the rehabilitation center, phones rang, insurance authorizations failed, and an elderly man became upset because his transportation had dropped him at the wrong entrance. I found him a wheelchair, rescheduled 2 evaluations, and reminded a new employee which therapist handled neurological cases. For several hours, nobody knew that my daughter had spent Christmas pretending to be a dead child. I was simply the woman behind the desk who knew how to fix a crowded schedule. The normality steadied me. It reminded me that I could make decisions without Mark explaining what they meant. During lunch, I called Dana Keller, a family attorney recommended by one of my coworkers. I expected the consultation to feel dramatic. Instead, Dana sat across from me in a small office with a legal pad and asked practical questions about our marriage, our income, Sophie's school, and whether anyone was in immediate physical danger. "No," I said. "He has never hit either of us." "That matters," she replied. "It does not mean emotional pressure is harmless, but it affects what a court can do immediately." I showed her the written boundary I had sent before Christmas, Mark's response, the delayed return time, and my notes containing Sophie's exact words. I did not show her theories about an affair, or claim Claire intended to take my child. Dana read quietly before setting the pages down. "You can file for divorce and request a temporary parenting arrangement," she said. "You cannot erase Mark's rights as Sophie's father because he exercised poor judgment during one holiday. You also cannot treat Claire as legally dangerous without evidence that she presents a specific risk." The answer disappointed the frightened part of me that wanted someone to declare Mark unfit and place a wall around Sophie before sunset. The clearer part of me knew Dana was right. What should I do now? Keep communication in writing when possible. Do not threaten him with evidence. Do not move joint money into a hidden account or leave the state with Sophie. Do not ask your daughter to carry messages or choose between parents. Gather copies of financial documents you already have a right to access and decide where Sophie will stay if you need an adult conversation without her present. She paused before adding, "Most importantly, do not wait for him to confess before you believe what you have already observed." I left her office without filing anything that day. I was not ready to take the final step, but I was finished being unprepared. Over the next day, I copied our tax returns, mortgage statements, insurance information, and Sophie's school records. I opened an individual checking account for my future paychecks, without draining our shared account. I asked my cousin Linda whether Sophie could spend an afternoon with her if I needed to attend an appointment. Linda did not demand an explanation. She only said Sophie was always welcome. I kept my plans quiet, not because I wanted to trap Mark, but because every concern I raised became material he used against me. I stopped asking whether he loved Claire. I stopped asking what the photographs meant. I watched what he did. Mark noticed the change. One evening, he brought home white roses and placed them in the center of the kitchen table. He apologized for being impatient and said the holidays had stirred up grief he thought he had buried. He suggested the three of us take a weekend trip after the house closed. "Somewhere warm," he said. "No Claire, no old photographs, no therapists, just us." For a few minutes, I wanted to believe him. The flowers smelled clean and sweet, and Sophie laughed when he promised a hotel with an indoor pool. I imagined Claire handing over the house keys on January 25th, driving away, and taking the red dress, silver bell, and Hannah's stocking with her. Perhaps our marriage had been pulled into someone else's grief and would return to us once the house was gone. That hope lasted until Sophie climbed into my bed that night. "Is Claire going to live with Dad when your turn is over?" she asked. I turned toward her. "What turn?" "Your turn being his family." My mouth went dry. "Who said I had a turn?" Sophie rubbed the edge of my blanket between her fingers. "Dad told Claire you had 8 good years. He said she waited long enough." "Did he say that to you?" "No, I was in the hallway. They thought I was changing. I did not ask anything else." Her answer had been spontaneous, and I would not make her search her memory for details to calm my fear. I pulled her close and told her that no adult was allowed to decide she had to replace one mother with another. After she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Mark's flowers between me and my phone. The roses no longer looked like an apology. They looked like a way to keep me quiet until his deadline arrived. For weeks, I had asked Mark what Claire wanted, what Claire believed, and why Claire had participated. Every answer had passed through him first. He had translated her intentions for me, and mine for her, keeping us angry at a version of each other neither of us had confirmed. I searched through an old group message created when Mark helped Claire arrange donated furniture before the house sale. Her number was still there. I copied it into a new conversation and began writing. I first typed that I was sorry to bother her. I deleted it. Then I wrote that I did not want conflict. I deleted that too. Politeness had become another way of asking permission to know what had happened to my own daughter. Finally, I sent the question that mattered. "Claire, Mark says you asked Sophie to call you Mom. I need to know what he told you I agreed to." The typing symbol appeared almost immediately. It vanished, returned, and remained long enough for me to feel every beat of my heart. Then Claire's reply filled the screen. "Rachel, Mark told me the entire Christmas was your idea." Claire's message remained on my screen while I read it 3 times. "Mark told me the entire Christmas was your idea." The sentence should have made me feel vindicated, but it only widened the distance between what I knew and what had happened inside Claire's house. I called her before I could lose my nerve. Claire answered after the second ring, but neither of us greeted the other warmly. Her voice was controlled, almost formal, as though she expected every word to be used against her. "You said Mark told you Christmas was my idea," I began. "He said you wanted Sophie to help me say goodbye to the house," Claire replied. "He also said you changed your mind afterward because you saw how close he and I had become." I gripped the edge of the kitchen table. Claire did not sound confused. She sounded like a woman who had already decided I was punishing her for accepting something I had offered. "I never agreed to any of it," I said. I did not agree to the dress, the photographs, or Sophie calling you mom. Claire went silent for a moment before saying, "That is not what Mark showed me." I opened the message thread from Christmas week. I wrote this to him before he took her. "I do not consent to Sophie being pressured to call anyone else mom. She comes home by 7, and I need to be able to reach her." He answered that I was turning an act of kindness into something ugly. The other end of the call became so quiet that I checked whether we were still connected. Claire finally said, "He never showed me that." "What did he show you?" She hesitated. "This is not a conversation I want to have over the phone." Neither did I. But I did not trust Mark enough to invite Claire into my home, and I was not going back to hers. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between us. I arranged for Sophie to spend a few hours with Linda and told Mark she had a playdate. It was the first time I had hidden a meeting from my husband. The secrecy felt wrong, until I remembered that every honest question I had asked him had been turned into a flaw in me. Claire was already seated when I arrived. She had chosen a table near the front windows, far from the other customers. Without the red dress, the old house, and Mark beside her, she looked less like the woman who had tried to replace me, and more like someone who had not slept properly in weeks. Neither of us reached for the coffee we had ordered. Claire placed her phone on the table. "I need you to understand that I would not have done this if I thought Sophie was being taken from you." "She was not taken from me," I said. "She was told my role could be handed to you because you were sad. That was enough." Claire lowered her eyes. "Mark said you had chosen the dress." I stared at her. I did not even know the dress existed until Christmas morning. She opened a message and slid the phone toward me. Mark had written it 2 weeks before Christmas. "Rachel found Hannah's red dress in one of the boxes. She thinks Sophie wearing it might help her understand what you lost. She wants Sophie to call you mom for the day, so you can say goodbye to that part of the house properly." The wording made me nauseous because it sounded almost like me. Mark had borrowed the compassion I had shown toward Hannah for years and used it to give his lie my voice. "I never saw that dress," I said. "I did not find it. I did not suggest it, and I would never have asked Sophie to call you mom." Claire rubbed her thumb against the side of her cup. "He said your marriage had already ended emotionally. He said you were waiting until after the holidays to tell Sophie because you did not want Christmas associated with the separation." For several seconds, I tried to make her statement fit beside the man who had brought me roses, suggested a family trip, and promised everything would return to normal after the house sale. "He told me you were moving away after the closing," I said. "He said once the house sold on January 25th, you would be gone, and our family could go back to normal." Claire looked at me. "He told me you would be gone." We spent the next several minutes trying to find some narrow space where both stories could be true. Perhaps Mark meant Claire would leave the house, but remain nearby. Perhaps he planned to separate from me temporarily while still taking the trip he had suggested. Perhaps he had used careless language because he wanted to comfort both of us. Every possibility collapsed against the messages in front of us. Mark had not misunderstood two women. He had given each of us the future she needed to stay quiet. Claire leaned back and pressed her fingers against her forehead. I wanted to believe him. I did not answer immediately. "The sale feels like losing Hannah again," she continued. "I know that sounds irrational. The house is only wood and plaster, but her height marks are inside the pantry door. Her room still smells like the lavender spray she used because she thought it made her grown up. When Mark said you understood, I believed him because I needed someone to tell me I was not wrong for wanting one last day." I heard the grief in her voice. But I also saw Sophie in my bed asking when my turn as her mother would end. "Wanting his story to be true does not make what happened to Sophie disappear," I said. Claire's face tightened, but she did not defend herself. "No, it doesn't." That answer changed something between us. It did not make her innocent, and it did not make me trust her. It only showed me that she could hear a painful truth without immediately finding a way to make me responsible for it. "What happened when they arrived?" I asked. Claire looked toward the window. Sophie was already wearing the dress, Mark said she had been excited all morning. He told me she had practiced calling me Mom in the car, but she might become shy once she saw me. She never practiced with me. I know that now. Did she call you Mom? Not at first. She called me Claire. Mark corrected her before I could say anything. Claire swallowed. He said, "Remember the Christmas word." She looked at him and said, "Mom." The phrase made my skin crawl. Mark had reduced the most important name in Sophie's world to a cue in a performance. Did she ever say she did not want to do it? She was very quiet. I asked whether she liked the dress, and she said it was itchy. Mark said she always complained when she was nervous. When she asked where you were, he said you wanted us to have the day without interruptions. You believed him. Yes. The admission came without an excuse. Claire unlocked her phone again. I recorded of the nest of the photograph because Sophie looked tired or Claire was not smiling enough. He said we needed to preserve the last Christmas in the house properly. You mean you recorded video as well? She nodded. Some short clips and one longer file. I have not watched all of it since that night. I need to see the originals. Her hand closed around the phone. There are things in those videos that belong to Hannah. Her room, her photographs, some boxes I never let anyone open. I am ashamed of how much I allowed Mark to recreate. I am not asking for ownership of Hannah's memories, I said. I am asking for the truth about what happened to Sophie. Claire looked at me for a long time before nodding. I need to copy the original files from my camera. I will bring them when we meet again. Before we left, she opened one final message. Mark had sent it to her the morning after Christmas. Give me until January 25th. Then Rachel will be gone, and we can decide what our family looks like. I read it twice. The date he had promised me would end Claire's place in our marriage was the same date he had promised Claire would end mine. We left the coffee shop separately. I had barely reached my car when my phone vibrated. Claire had sent a 10-second video with no explanation. Sophie stood in the red velvet dress, the silver bell pressed against her throat. She looked toward someone behind the camera and asked, "When can I be Sophie again?" Mark's voice answered without hesitation. "After the picture. Don't ruin this for Claire." Claire's house looked smaller without Christmas lights. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. Pale rectangles marked the walls where family photographs had hung, and the rooms echoed when we walked through them. It did not feel luxurious or romantic. It felt like a place that had been waiting 13 years for someone to admit the people who once lived there were not coming back. Claire led me upstairs without pretending the visit would be easy. Hannah's bedroom was nearly empty, but a faded strip of wallpaper still ran behind the bed frame. Small pencil marks climbed the pantry-side doorframe, each labeled with Hannah's age. The final line stopped at 7. Sophie is almost exactly the height Hannah was, Claire said. Mark noticed before I did. I looked at the empty space where the bed had stood. That is why he chose her. Claire nodded. She did not tell me. The girls looked alike or suggest that Sophie carried some part of Hannah. For the first time, she seemed determined not to turn one child into an explanation for the other. We returned downstairs and sat at a folding table, because most of the furniture had already been removed. Claire placed her camera, laptop, and phone in front of us. Before opening the files, she said there was something I needed to understand about Mark's guilt. The last Christmas Hannah was alive had not been dramatic. There had been no accident, emergency, or final goodbye anyone recognized at the time. Mark and Claire argued that afternoon because he accepted a work call after promising to remain home. He left the house angry and told Claire he would return when she could speak to him, without making everything a crisis. Hannah kept asking when he was coming back, Claire said. She wanted him to help build a dollhouse she had opened that morning. I kept saying soon, even after I stopped believing it. Mark returned after midnight, when Hannah was already asleep. A few weeks later, she died, following complications from an illness they had believed was improving. Mark never had another Christmas with her, and the unopened dollhouse remained in the corner of her room for years. Claire stared at the dark screen of her laptop. At the funeral, I told him he had abandoned the last happy day she ever had. I wanted him to hurt as much as I did. I have regretted that sentence ever since. I understood how a cruel sentence spoken inside unbearable grief could live longer than the person who said it. I also understood what Mark had done with it. He decided that if he rebuilt the day perfectly, he could prove you were wrong, I said. Claire's eyes filled, but she did not look away. He said we could finally give Hannah the Christmas she should have had. I told myself it was symbolic. I knew Sophie was uncomfortable, and I stayed in the room because I wanted the picture. Your grief explains why you wanted it, I said. It does not give either of you the right to use my daughter. I know. The lack of argument did not erase my anger. It only kept the conversation honest enough to continue. Claire opened the oldest video file first. The recording began in the upstairs hallway on Christmas morning. Sophie stood in her own green sweater and black leggings, while Mark held the red velvet dress against her shoulders. The silver bell hung from his fingers. I want to wear my clothes, Sophie said. Mark crouched until his face was level with hers. Claire needs this. You said you wanted to help her feel better. I can help in my sweater. His smile tightened. It will not work the same way. Claire's voice came from behind the camera, asking Mark whether Sophie was certain. He answered before Sophie could speak. Rachel chose the dress. She thinks it will help Sophie understand Hannah. Beside me. Claire closed her eyes briefly. That was the moment I should have called you. The next clip showed Sophie in the living room after changing. Mark adjusted the bell at her throat while Claire arranged the stockings. Sophie called her Claire, and Mark stopped recording. Remember the Christmas word, he said. Sophie looked toward him. Mom, say it like you mean it. Mom. He recorded the greeting 4 times. Each time Sophie's voice grew quieter, and each time Mark told her the microphone had not caught the word clearly enough. In another video, Sophie stood beneath Hannah's stocking while Mark repositioned her shoulders. She asked when I was coming. Mark did not lower the camera. Rachel doesn't belong in this Christmas, he said. This is for the family that was here before. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. I had spent weeks wondering whether Mark wanted Claire instead of me. The video showed something worse. He had not simply removed his current wife. He had removed every person and fact that prevented the old photograph from feeling real. Claire appeared in the frame and told Mark that was enough. For one hopeful second, I thought she had stopped it. Then Mark said they only needed one good picture, and Claire returned to her place beside Sophie. The longer file began after dinner. Sophie's hair had come loose, and her eyes were swollen. Mark placed her between himself and Claire on the couch, then checked the old photograph on his phone before changing the angle of Sophie's knees. When can I be Sophie again? She asked. After the picture, Mark replied. Don't ruin this for Claire. Sophie looked down at her hands. Mark turned toward Claire and lowered his voice, but the camera continued recording. She's the same age Hannah was, he said. We finally get to do it right. Claire covered her mouth beside me. I had already heard part of the clip, but the final sentence changed everything. Mark was not comforting Claire or honoring Hannah. He was using Sophie to test whether the family in the old photograph could be rebuilt without acknowledging that every person in it had changed. In the video, Claire finally stepped out of position. She removed the silver bell from Sophie's neck and told Mark the pictures were finished. Then she took Sophie upstairs to change. Why did you not call me? I asked. Claire did not defend herself. Mark said he would tell you everything. He said you already planned to leave after the holidays, but he needed 1 month to arrange the separation without frightening Sophie. I knew something had gone wrong, and I still let him take her home without speaking to you. You let him control the truth because hearing it directly from me might have destroyed what you wanted. Yes. Her answer hurt because it was accurate. Claire had been deceived, but she had also protected the deception after she saw its cost. We placed our phones side by side and began arranging Mark's messages by date. On December 20th, he told me Claire needed one final Christmas before disappearing from our lives. That same afternoon, he told Claire I had chosen the dress and wanted Sophie to help reunite their family. On December 26th, he told me the house sale would close the chapter forever. Minutes later, he told Claire to give him until January 25th, and then I would be gone. He used the same phrases with both of us, but reversed who was leaving and who was waiting. Claire copied the original video files to a new drive and preserved the dates, times, and file information. She also forwarded the complete message thread, rather than screenshots that could be accused of missing context. I watched every transfer finish before placing the drive beside the silver bell. "Mark is coming here on the 25th after the closing appointment," Claire said. "He thinks I am waiting for him to tell me what he decided. He believes I am waiting too. What are you going to do?" I placed both phones beside each other again. "He should see that we are both waiting." The answer did not feel like revenge. It felt like the first decision I had made without measuring how Mark might describe me afterward. Before leaving, I packed the copied videos, the 2 message timelines, and the silver bell into one folder. I sat in my car outside the house and called Dana Keller. When she answered, I looked back at Hannah's dark bedroom window and thought of Sophie asking permission to become herself again. "I'm ready to file," I said. Dana filed the initial divorce petition on January 22nd. She explained each page before I signed it, including the fact that filing did not end my marriage that day or decide where Sophie would live permanently. It started a legal process and replaced Mark's private threats with rules neither of us could rewrite whenever an argument became inconvenient. The temporary parenting proposal was deliberately narrow. Sophie would remain in her current school and follow her usual routine. Mark and I would communicate directly rather than use her to carry messages. Claire would not participate in Sophie's care or holidays until the adults had addressed what happened at Christmas. Major decisions involving family traditions or emotional pressure would wait until we had professional guidance. Dana asked whether I wanted to request that Mark have no contact with Sophie. The frightened part of me wanted to say yes, but fear was not the same as judgment. Mark had ignored Sophie's discomfort and used her inside his conflict with me, yet he was still the father who packed her lunches, helped with math homework, and knew which song calmed her during thunderstorms. "I don't want to erase him," I said. "I want a structure that stops him from asking her to erase herself." Dana nodded and wrote the sentence in her notes. She reminded me that courts did not repair emotional wounds in one hearing, and a temporary proposal was not a declaration that one parent was good while the other was evil. It was a way to reduce the chances of Sophie being placed in the middle while the adults separated. I left the office with a stamped copy in a plain envelope. It felt surprisingly light for something that changed the direction of my life. I had expected relief or terror to arrive all at once. Instead, I felt both in small, alternating waves as I drove home. Dr. Shaw met with me briefly that afternoon, before Sophie's appointment. I told her Mark and I were separating, that Sophie had repeated another comment about my turn as his family, and that there would be an adult conversation on January 25th. I did not give her Claire's video or ask her to decide whether Mark was manipulative. She was Sophie's therapist, not my investigator. "Keep the explanation simple," Dr. Shaw advised. "Tell her what changes, what does not change, and what she is not responsible for." After the appointment, Sophie and I sat in the car while sleet tapped against the windshield. She had been unusually quiet since leaving Dr. Shaw's office. Before I started the engine, she asked, "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" I wanted to ask who had told her, but that would have made her responsible for another adult's words. "Your dad and I may live in different homes," I said. "The grown-up decisions are still being worked out." "Do I have to choose where I'm a daughter?" "No, you are my daughter everywhere. You are also Dad's daughter everywhere. Nobody is asking you to choose a parent." Her eyes filled. "Is it because I called Claire Mom?" I unfastened my seatbelt and turned toward her. "Nothing happening between Dad and me is your fault. You said a word because adults put you in a situation you should never have been asked to manage. A word cannot end a marriage, and it cannot take your mother away." She leaned against me, and I held her until the sleet softened into rain. I knew there would be more questions, perhaps for months. I did not need to answer all of them that afternoon. I only needed to stop allowing Mark's version to reach her before she was old enough to understand it. When we arrived home, white roses stood in a vase on the kitchen table. Mark was making grilled cheese sandwiches and humming along with the radio. He kissed Sophie's forehead, asked about therapy as if he had never objected to it, and told her to choose a movie for after dinner. Once she left the room, he gestured toward the flowers. I know the last month has been difficult. After Claire signs the papers and moves, we can start over. I looked at the roses and remembered the first bouquet he had brought home. That time, I had mistaken softness for change. Now I understood that gentleness could also be a way of delaying consequences. Exactly what happens on January 25th? I asked. Mark continued buttering the bread. Claire signs the final house documents. The buyers get the keys. She leaves town afterward. And that date has no other meaning? He glanced at me. What other meaning would it have? I let the silence remain long enough for him to hear his own answer. Then we should all be clear by that night. His hand paused over the frying pan. What does that mean? It means I heard you. I did not mention Claire's messages, the original files, or the petition inside my work bag. Mark had spent weeks deciding what I was permitted to know. I no longer believed I owed him access to every step I took to protect myself. His tenderness lasted until the next morning. Sophie came into my room while I was getting dressed and closed the door behind her. Dad said you're mad because you want to break our family, she whispered. I knelt in front of her. Did he ask you to tell me that? She shook her head. He said I should remember who is trying to keep us together. The sentence was designed to turn every boundary I placed into evidence against me. I hugged Sophie and told her she did not have to decide which adult loved the family more. Then I sent Mark a written message from the next room. Do not discuss our marriage, divorce, or blame with Sophie. She is not to carry explanations or choose sides. His reply arrived less than a minute later. You do not control what I say to my own daughter. I saved it and forwarded a copy to Dana. It did not magically settle anything, and I did not treat it as proof that Mark should lose Sophie. It confirmed something simpler and more important. A private promise from him would never be enough. When he felt control slipping, he would reach for the person least able to challenge him. I arranged for Sophie to stay with Linda on the evening of January 25th. I told her the adults needed to discuss the house sale, and that she could bake cookies with Linda and sleep there if it became late. She asked whether Dad knew. I said he would know she was safe, but she would not be present for the conversation. Claire called me that afternoon. Her voice shook before she finished her first sentence. I don't think I can come tomorrow. I stood in the dining room, looking at the place where Mark's flowers had begun to wilt. You do not have to come for me to proceed. He will say I betrayed him. He told each of us the other one had agreed. He betrayed both conversations before we compared them. I should have stopped Christmas sooner. Yes, I said. You should have. She inhaled sharply, but I did not soften the truth to keep her from leaving. You can send the original files to Dana and stay home. I will still speak to Mark. I will still move forward with the divorce. My decision does not depend on whether you can face him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Claire said, I'll come. I'm bringing the original phone. On January 25th, I took Sophie to Linda's house before Mark returned from the closing appointment. Sophie hugged me at the door and asked whether I would pick her up in the morning. I promised I would. I did not promise that everything at home would remain the same. Claire arrived shortly before 6. She placed her phone on the dining table and sat beside me without removing her coat. I arranged only 4 things in front of us. The silver bell lay in the center. Our 2 phones rested on either side of the written timeline. Dana's envelope sat closest to my hand. There were no dramatic lights, hidden cameras, or extra witnesses. The crooked paper star with Sophie's name still hung on the Christmas tree because she had asked me not to take it down. That was the only decoration I needed. At 6:28, Mark sent a message saying he was on his way home. A second message followed. "Is Sophie there?" I replied that Sophie was safe. He called immediately. I let the phone ring until it stopped. When he called again, I turned the screen face down and did not explain further. Claire looked toward the hallway. He knows something is wrong. He knows he no longer has all the information. Headlights crossed the front window several minutes later. A car door closed, followed by Mark's footsteps on the porch. Claire's hands tightened in her lap, but she remained seated. The front door opened. Mark entered the dining room, saw Claire beside me, and stopped so suddenly that his keys slipped from his hand. The keys struck the hardwood and slid beneath the edge of the dining table. Mark did not bend to retrieve them. His gaze moved from Claire to me, then to the two phones and the silver bell between us. The color drained from his face so quickly that the skin around his mouth looked gray. "Why is she here?" he asked. Claire turned her phone toward him. "You told me Rachel asked Sophie to call me Mom. I placed my phone beside hers. And you told me Claire was selling the house, moving away, and disappearing from our lives after Christmas." Mark stayed near the doorway, still wearing his coat. For several seconds, his eyes moved between the screens as though he were searching for the one sentence that would make both messages true. Then he exhaled and stepped into the room. "You have taken private conversations out of context," he said. "I was trying to manage an impossible situation without hurting either of you." I pulled out the chair across from us. "Then explain the context." He seemed surprised that I was not shouting. He sat slowly and pointed toward Claire's phone. Claire was emotionally fragile because of the house sale. I told her what she needed to hear so she could get through Christmas. "That does not mean I intended to leave you." Claire's expression hardened. "You told me Rachel had already agreed to separate, and that you needed 1 month before she moved out." Mark replied that he had only been trying to keep her calm. Claire leaned forward. "Then why did you tell Rachel I was leaving?" Mark looked at me. "Because Rachel was already jealous. If I had told her how unstable you were, she would have stopped Sophie from coming." My hands were cold beneath the table, but my voice stayed steady. "Why did Sophie have to become Hannah to protect either of us?" "She did not become Hannah," he said. I reminded him that Sophie had worn Hannah's dress, stood beneath Hannah's stocking, worn Hannah's bell, and been told to call Claire Mom. Mark's gaze shifted toward Claire. "That was her idea. Claire wanted one last photograph in the house. I agreed because I thought it might help her let go." Claire unlocked her phone. "Then we should watch the part where I asked you whether Sophie was sure." The video began with Sophie standing in the upstairs hallway in her own clothes. Mark appeared in the frame, holding the red velvet dress against her shoulders. When Sophie said she wanted to keep her sweater on, he told her the picture would not work the same way. He fastened the silver bell around her neck, corrected where she stood, and reminded her to use the Christmas word. Mark reached across the table for the phone. I placed my hand over it before he could touch it. "No, this time, you listen." He looked at me with an anger so immediate that I finally saw what had always been beneath his calm explanations. He was not furious because the video was false. He was furious because he could no longer control when it stopped. Claire played the longer file. Sophie stood between them on the cream-colored couch, her hands pressed together in her lap. She asked, "When can I be Sophie again?" Mark's recorded voice answered, "After the picture. Don't ruin this for Claire." No one in the dining room moved. Then the next line came through the speaker, quieter but clear. "She's the same age Hannah was. We finally get to do it right." Mark's shoulders dropped. The denial left his face, and something harder replaced it. He told me I did not understand what that Christmas meant. He had walked out on Hannah's last Christmas because he and Claire were fighting. Hannah waited for him to return, but he did not come home until she was asleep. A few weeks later, she was dead, and he had lived with that memory every day for 13 years. "I know you lost your daughter," I said. Mark shook his head. "No, you know the sentence. You do not know what it feels like to lose a child, And remember the exact door you closed behind you. I did not tell him my pain was equal to his. It was not. I did not argue that I understood a loss I had never lived. Your grief did not force you to tell Claire I was leaving. It did not force you to tell me she was leaving. It did not make you ignore Sophie while she begged to be herself. Mark looked toward the bell. I was trying to repair one memory. I told him he had repaired nothing. He had only given another 7-year-old a memory. She now needed help surviving. Claire folded her hands in front of her. I allowed the first picture because I wanted Hannah back for 1 hour. That was wrong. I saw Sophie was uncomfortable and waited too long to stop it. Her voice shook, but she continued. I wanted an hour. You wanted to turn that hour into a new family. Mark turned toward her as if her confession had opened a door. Then stop pretending this has to end badly. Everything is finally out. Rachel wanted the truth, and now she has it. You and I can still begin again without lies. Claire stared at him. Hannah was our daughter. She is not an empty place for Sophie to fill. She pushed the storage drive across the table toward me, then removed the silver bell from her bag and placed it beside the phones. The original files are all there. I am not helping you do this again. Mark watched her rise and ordered her to sit down. Claire put on her coat instead. I spent 13 years believing the worst thing you did was leave that Christmas afternoon. I was wrong. The worst thing you did was decide another child owed you a better ending. After the front door closed behind her, Mark remained motionless. He had expected one of us to remain available after the other walked away. For the first time, neither woman was waiting to be chosen. He turned back to me. We can still save our marriage if you stop humiliating me and think about what this will do to Sophie. I asked whether he remembered telling me to divorce him if I did not like his plan. I was angry, he said. I did not mean it literally. You meant for me to be afraid. I opened the envelope beside my hand. Inside was the stamped divorce petition Dana had filed and the proposed temporary parenting arrangement. I placed both documents in front of him. You used divorce to make me afraid of losing this family, I said. Then you showed me the family was already unsafe. Mark scanned the first page, then looked toward the hallway as though Sophie might appear. You cannot keep my daughter from me. I am not trying to erase her father. I am trying to stop her father from asking her to erase herself. I explained the next steps without threatening him. Communication about Sophie would be in writing. He would stay in a short-term apartment arranged through his employer, while Dana and his attorney discussed the house and temporary schedule. Sophie would remain in school and follow a predictable routine. Claire would not participate in her care. Nothing on the table was a final judgment, but the days when Mark could create private rules and call them family decisions were over. He looked from the filed petition to Claire's empty chair. The confidence that had carried him through the previous month was gone. There was no longer a grieving ex-wife waiting for him to return, and no frightened current wife waiting for him to choose correctly. Mark picked up his keys from the floor and left the dining room without touching the bell. I heard the bedroom door open upstairs as he began packing a bag, but I did not follow him. I did not feel triumphant. My hands shook, my chest hurt, and part of me still wanted to wake from the entire month and return to the kitchen table before he ever said Claire's name. When the front door finally closed, the house became quiet. I looked toward the Christmas tree we had left, standing for Sophie. Her crooked paper star still hung near the front, turning slightly in the warm air from the vent. Each time it moved, her name came back into view. For the first time since Christmas morning, I could read it without fearing that someone would try to replace it. Mark moved into a furnished apartment 3 days after the confrontation. Dana made sure the temporary arrangement was written down before anyone changed addresses or schedules. He was not thrown into the street, and I did not change the locks while he was at work. He packed what he needed, signed for the apartment through his employer, and returned the next evening for the rest of his clothes, while Sophie was with Linda. The divorce did not happen in one dramatic afternoon. It happened through forms, meetings, revised proposals, and conversations I wished Sophie never had to know existed. Some mornings I felt certain. Other mornings I woke, reaching toward Mark's side of the bed, before remembering why it was empty. Filing had been the right decision, but right decisions could still hurt. Our temporary parenting schedule gave Sophie something she needed more than either of us winning. It gave her predictability. She stayed with me on school nights and spent scheduled afternoons and alternating weekends with Mark. Changes had to be agreed on in writing. Claire was not involved in visits, and neither of us could discuss the divorce with Sophie in a way that asked her to carry blame. Mark objected to almost every boundary at first. He wrote that Claire and I had formed an alliance to punish him. He said I had used a grieving woman to build a case against the father of my child. When I answered, I kept my messages brief and limited them to Sophie's schedule, school, therapy, and health. Once our words remained on a screen, Mark could no longer replace one version with another and insist I had misunderstood. The parenting counselor did not call Mark a monster. She asked him to listen while Sophie described what it felt like to believe kindness required giving away her mother. Mark tried to explain that he had never intended to frighten her. The counselor stopped him and said intention did not erase impact. He had to hear that more than once. Attending counseling did not transform him. Some weeks he arrived defensive and left angry. Other weeks he apologized, then weakened the apology by explaining why he had believed the Christmas photograph was necessary. Still, he began following the schedule. He stopped mentioning Claire to Sophie. When Sophie said she did not want to talk about Hannah, he learned to let the subject end. I did not treat those small changes as redemption. I treated them as responsibilities he should have accepted from the beginning. Sophie returned to herself in uneven pieces. She slept through the night, then woke crying after a dream she could not explain. She started calling me mom without pausing, but sometimes asked whether I would still be her mother after a court meeting or after spending a weekend with Mark. I gave her the same answer every time. Divorce changes where grown-ups live. It does not change who your mother is. You did not betray me by doing what Dad asked. By spring, she chose a red shirt for school picture day. I noticed, but I did not celebrate as though a color proved she was healed. I only told her it looked good with her jeans. She rolled her eyes and said she already knew. Claire's letter arrived in May. She did not ask to see Sophie or suggest that the three of us had become friends because we had confronted Mark together. She wrote that the house had been sold, and Hannah's things had been moved into proper storage, except for a small memorial box she kept in her new apartment. The silver bell was inside it. Claire wrote that she had mistaken longing for permission. She had wanted 1 hour in which Hannah's absence did not control the room, and she had allowed another child to carry the weight of that wish. She did not ask me to forgive her. She only said she was sorry, and that Sophie would never again be asked to stand in Hannah's place. I replied with 3 sentences. I told her I had received the letter, that I appreciated her returning the bell to Hannah's box, and that I hoped she continued facing her grief honestly. I did not offer friendship. The truth had required us to sit at the same table once. It did not require us to remain in each other's lives. Mark had to face something harder than losing both marriages. Hannah and Sophie could no longer be blended into one story that made him feel less guilty. Hannah was his daughter who had died. Sophie was his living daughter, with her own fears, preferences, and right to say no. Loving one could not mean reshaping the other. I had my own truth to face. I had seen the first warning when Mark called motherhood a role that could be loaned out for a day. I had felt the danger in the dress, the closed door, and the way Sophie asked whether I would still be her mother. I waited for more proof, because I wanted someone else to confirm that my instincts were reasonable. That was the part I promised myself would change. I would not make Sophie pay for my fear of being called difficult. The next time something inside me said a boundary had been crossed, I would listen before the damage became easier to document than to prevent. By the following Christmas, the divorce was in its final stage. The house had been refinanced, the parenting schedule had become routine, and the arguments about furniture and accounts had been reduced to paperwork Dana handled without involving Sophie. None of it felt like victory. It felt like a life slowly becoming honest. Sophie and I bought a smaller tree for the living room. She decorated it with paper snowflakes, wooden birds, and ornaments collected from school projects. Near the bottom of the storage box, she found the crooked yellow star we had made the year before. The glitter had rubbed away, and the letters across the middle had faded. "I can fix it," she said. She spread newspaper over the kitchen table and painted the star a warm gold. When it dried, she took a green marker and wrote "Sophie" across the center. The final E bent down one side again. "Do you need help?" I asked. She shook her head without looking up. "No, I know how to spell my own name." It was not a speech. She sounded proud in the ordinary way children sound proud when they remember a difficult word or tie their shoes without help. That made it more powerful than anything an adult could have taught her to say. She carried the star to the tree and placed it on a branch left of center. I asked whether she wanted it higher. Sophie stepped back, tilted her head, and said she liked it exactly where it was. At 7, Mark called at the time we had agreed on. Sophie answered from the couch and told him about her school concert, the cookies she had burned with Linda, and the book she wanted for Christmas. She did not call anyone by the wrong name. She did not perform happiness or protect either parent from discomfort. She was simply a child talking to her father. I could not know whether Mark would become the safe father Sophie deserved. That would depend on what he did over years, not what he promised in one phone call. For the moment, he listened without correcting her, and when their time ended, he said goodnight and let her hang up first. After Sophie went to bed, I turned off the room lights and left only the tree glowing. Her star hung slightly crooked, turning whenever warm air rose from the vent. Each time it faced me, her name appeared across the gold paper. Mark had tried to repair an empty place by forcing one child into another child's shape. Claire had tried to borrow motherhood for an hour so grief would hurt less. I had nearly ignored my own fear because I wanted someone else to tell me I was allowed to act. None of us could repair a family by making someone disappear. A safe family was not one where nobody left. It was one where nobody had to become someone else to be loved. As Sophie's star turned once more in the Christmas lights, her own name came back into view.